I would like to thank you for viewing my presentation on automating Salesforce data migrations with Python. If you would like to download a copy of the slides from this presentation, please visit our website at www.radixbay.com. There is a resources link in the upper right corner. In addition to my presentation, I'll also be providing a brief data migration demo. Here's a brief intro to the services my company provides. On the right part of the slide, you can see that we offer a wide range of support solutions. I am a member of the RadixBay Salesforce consulting team. My team is able to tailor your Salesforce products to your business needs, easily integrate your platform with other services, and fully leverage all of Salesforce's advanced features. Here's today's agenda. We will begin with a traditional introduction, introduce the migration process, and I'll provide a demo. After the demo, we'll take a look at the tools and libraries that we can use to automate our migrations, and I'll provide my top 5 recommendations. At the end, I'll provide you with a list of resources that will help you build out your own data migrations. I'll make sure to upload a copy of my slides to our website at www.radixbay.com. That way you can download a copy and access all of the websites I have provided on my resources slide. Here is a subset of the products and tools that we will be discussing during the presentation. The list of products may look a bit challenging at first, but by the end of the presentation, I think you'll find that with a bit of time, you'll be able to use them to automate your own data migrations. So, what is a data migration? Data migrations involve moving data from one system to another. This typically occurs during Salesforce implementations where you're moving data from a legacy system into the new Salesforce system. So this data must be migrated before go live. Therefore, this can be really stressful and time-consuming, especially if you perform the data migration manually, you lack a well-thought-out migration plan, or you don't understand the client data. I have experience performing 2 data migrations. The first migration involved moving data from Microsoft Dynamics into Salesforce. This migration involved a lot of data transformations and data cleanup. The second migration I performed involved moving data from Salesforce to Salesforce. This was easier to complete than my first migration, but I still ran into some unexpected issues. The data migrations I completed involved several steps. This is just a general overview of each step I took. I will go into more detail about some of these steps later in the presentation. The first step involves the client extracting data from the legacy systems. I received the data in CSV format. I then took the data and thoroughly analyzed it. Then I used that analysis to transform and clean the data. Once I finished transforming the data, I loaded the data into Microsoft Access. I used Microsoft Access so that all the data would be prepped and stored in one location. It also made it easier to quickly view the data. Once the data was in Microsoft Access, I took the data from there and loaded it into Salesforce. I used Python to automate majority of this process. One of the steps I mentioned was analyzing the data. You'll want to make sure that you manually observe the data before you begin writing any data transformations. If you find that a CSV is too large to view in Excel, you can always use Python to split that CSV into smaller files. For example, a client provided a CSV that had over 3 million records. The record limit in Excel is around 1 million records, so I couldn't view that CSV in Excel. Therefore, I used Python to get a subset of that data so I could observe it manually. Then I used Python to automate the collection of data analysis. I have provided a list of some of the analysis you can automate. For example, you can get the number of records, the number of columns, the count of values in each column. You can even check if a field is nullable or not. Here is an example of a file that's generated when I run my data analysis tool. I will demo that later on in the presentation. Another major step in the migration process is transforming the data. You'll want to use the analysis you collected and client requirements to transform your data. You'll want to automate as many data transformations as possible. I've listed a few transformations that I had to complete and you may encounter whenever you perform a data transformation. Those transformations include updating record types, updating file names, cleaning email addresses, and fixing dates. Here are two examples of both cleaning email addresses and updating file names. You'll likely have to update the file names of any Salesforce content the client provides you with. Whenever the client runs an export to get the content, those files are given the name of their legacy system ID. I recommend you use code to update the file names because you don't want to have to do that manually if there are a lot of files. You should determine the order of migration before building out any migration code. The order of migration is extremely important. For example, you can't load in any records if you haven't loaded in the users. Any records that you load in without providing an owner ID will be assigned to you instead of the correct record owner. Another example is that you wouldn't be able to load in a set of contacts if their related account isn't already in Salesforce. Now I will give a brief demo of my data migration tool. In this demo, we will analyze and load in 10 accounts using both my data analysis tool and my data migration tool. Here you can see the 10 accounts that we will load in. First, I want to run a data analysis on these accounts. As you can see, we don't have any data analysis files listed for this account yet. To gather that data analysis, I will run my tool now. You can see that the data analysis has been completed, and you can see that the file has been generated. Let's open that up. All right. On the summary tab, you can see the number of records, which is 10, and the number of columns, which is 18. And on the analysis tab, you can see a list of the fields and information about the data, such as the maximum length of values in a field, the count of values in each field, the distinct count, whether the field is nullable or not, and the field usage. All right, now that we have the data analysis, I'll close this out. And I'll also close out the tool. Now I want to load this data into Microsoft Access. Here you can see that we don't have any tables in the Access database, so I will just run my migration tool. All right, now you see that the data has been loaded in. This was quick because it was only 10 records. Let's go back to the database, and you can see that the account table has been loaded in. All right, now that the data has been loaded into Microsoft Access, let's load this data into Salesforce. In Salesforce, you can see that I have a list view for these accounts that we're going to load in. And you can see the job ID that will be used to pull those accounts into this list view. And just refresh and let you guys see that there aren't any accounts here. And now let's run the migration tool. And hopefully the accounts will load in without any errors. All right, if you look right here, you can see that there were 10 successful upserts and 0 errors. So if I refresh the page, you can see that we have those 10 accounts in this list view. Let's continue our discussion by taking a look at the tools and libraries I use for my data migrations. We will begin by reviewing Pandas. Pandas is a Python library that can be used for data analysis and data transformations. Python Pandas has 3 main data structures, which includes data frames, which are similar to tables, series, which are similar to columns in a table, and dictionaries, which are key value pairs that aren't Pandas specific, but they're used to do things like update values and rename columns in a data frame. Here are some of the functions and attributes I use the most during the data migrations. I won't cover all of these, but you can see that there are functions to load the data into a data frame from a CSV. You have functions and attributes that you can use to run data analysis. You have functions that are similar to like a VLOOKUP in Excel or a join in SQL. And then you have other functions that can be used for data transformations like dropping columns, filling blank values, and even applying your own custom Python functions to the data frame. The next library I used was PYPYODBC. This library is used to connect Python to the Microsoft Access database. This library will allow you to query, insert, and delete Microsoft Access data. It can be slow at times. For example, I was trying to load in 60,000 contact records one time, and it took around 30 minutes to load those records into Microsoft Access. And then it had to be loaded into Salesforce. There's another library that can be used to load the data into Microsoft Access, which is just called PYPYODBC, but I received errors with that package. So this is the reason why I'm using this one instead of that one. This snippet of code shows how to connect to an Access database and manipulate it using PYPYODBC. You can see that the text is printed to the console to provide updates as the data is loaded into the Access database. I placed this database function in a utilities file so that it could be reused throughout the migration code. The next library I used was Simple Salesforce. Simple Salesforce can be used to connect to any Salesforce, or you can create records, you can query records, but I mostly use this just to query records using SOQL. SOQL, or Salesforce's object query language, is similar to SQL. At the bottom, you can see where I connected to the Salesforce or using the username, password, and security token. You'll want to identify the domain if you're connecting to a sandbox, and the domain will be test. Otherwise, you can leave the domain off and you'll be able to connect to a production org. After you connect to Salesforce using the Simple Salesforce library, you will be able to query records. I wrote my query in a function that I included in the utilities file so that it could be reused throughout my code. And you can see examples here of me querying user data, contact data, etc. The next tool I use is batch files. Batch files are used to automate Python scripts in any data loader jobs. You'll want to make sure that you list the scripts and the jobs in the correct load order. You can also use go-to commands and labels to skip ahead in the migration. For example, let's say you loaded in records for a few objects on Thursday and you want to load in the rest on Saturday. You can use that go-to command to point to the correct label in the batch file where you left off on Thursday. You'll want to minimize the amount of go-tos you use in your batch code to avoid any spaghetti code. You don't want to keep jumping around. You might accidentally load something in wrong or prep the wrong file. So just be careful with that. The next tool I use was Salesforce Switch. Salesforce Switch can be used to quickly enable and disable Salesforce configurations. You can disable things like workflows, process flows, triggers, and validation roles. It is important to turn off some of these configurations because they can update data and restrict records from being loaded in. The next tool I used was the Attachments and Notes Migrator. This is an app exchange app by Salesforce. Clients may have older attachments and notes that they need to migrate. Those need to be upgraded so they are optimized for Salesforce Lightning. For those of you who don't know, Salesforce has two interfaces, it's Classic and Lightning. Lightning is the new and improved interface, and Salesforce is pushing to retire the Classic interface. Therefore, it is important to update these formats. Next, I used a data migration permission set. Now, this is not really a tool, but it's really needed for a Salesforce migration. Please ensure that you have these permissions enabled for your user, or you will not be able to load in records or update them as expected. The next tool I use is the AMP migration tool. In data migrations, you won't be able to migrate any data if you don't have the correct fields, pick list values, roles, or any other configurations that you'll need. You must push these config changes from a sandbox into your stage sandbox and then into the production sandbox. Or at least that's the process I use. Normally you would use change sets to deploy configurations, but you can use the AMP migration tool to retrieve and deploy your Salesforce configurations. The AMP migration tool allows you to move configurations to or from any Salesforce org. They don't even have to be related orgs. Here I have an example of how to retrieve metadata using the AMP migration tool. First, you'll want to define that metadata in your package.xml file. Then you'll create targets in the build.xml file. Next, call the ant target in your terminal. And then the metadata will be retrieved and it can be deployed to whichever Salesforce org you want it to be deployed to. The next tool I use is the package.xml builder tool. This tool quickly retrieves Salesforce metadata in XML format. This can be used with the AMP migration tool. As you can see, it has metadata listed and you can connect to any Salesforce org here as well. The final tool I used was Workbench. Workbench will allow you to connect to any Salesforce org. You can run queries, view metadata, and perform DML operations. For those of you who don't know what DML operations are, those are your insert, upsert, and export type operations. Workbench is great because it's good to have all these features in one location. Let's finish up by reviewing my top 5 recommendations, which are complete a data migration workbook, migrate using legacy IDs, check configuration, be aware of system limits, and test your configuration. I will dig a little deeper into each one of these in upcoming slides. My first recommendation is to complete a data migration workbook. You'll want to complete a data migration workbook so that you can have your data mapping for each object in one location. Data mapping is the process of choosing a destination for legacy data in a new system. You can also take note of any data transformations you performed in this workbook. You'll want to keep this workbook as updated as possible. Be sure to update any field names or API names if they change in the new system. My next recommendation is to migrate using legacy IDs. You'll want to do this so you can relate records using the legacy ID. This will allow you to avoid constant exports and VLOOKUPs. The only exception is that you cannot do this for polymorphic fields like the who ID and what ID fields for tasks and events. Polymorphic relationships occur when the reference object can be related to several different types of objects. For example, tasks can be related to more than one type of object. You'll want to create an external ID field in Salesforce on each object that will be included in the migration. Please note that there are a few objects that you will not be able to add external IDs to, like attachments and relations. My next recommendation is to check configuration. Certain configurations can cause errors, like restricted pick lists, validation rules, apex triggers, and flows. You'll want to deactivate these configurations before you run your migration code. I recommend that you unrestrict any pick lists and also turn off emails. And you can use that Salesforce Switch tool I mentioned earlier to turn off validation rules, triggers, and flows. Please note that you need to reset the configurations after the data migration. You don't want clients to use the system with incorrect configurations. Here's an example of an error I encountered because I did not check configurations. I was loading in event records and ran into a few errors. I also received flow emails from Salesforce. I realized that a process flow was causing the error, so I had to deactivate that process flow. Once I deactivated that process flow, I tried loading in the event records again, but I still ran into errors. The new error stated that I was loading in an invalid pick list value for the communication method field. So I went into setup and checked the pick list values in Salesforce, and I realized that the name of the pick list value was incorrect. So I went back and updated that in my migration code. The next recommendation I have is to be aware of system limits. Several limitations can cause errors during the migration, which extends the duration of the migration. For example, if I hit a Salesforce limit, I likely have to update my code and rerun both the data transformations and the loading process. For large amounts of records, this can take a while to rerun. This can apply to any system you migrate data to. You will need to learn what the system can and can't do to avoid unpleasant surprises during the migration. My final recommendation is to test your migration code. It's easy to set things up wrong, and you may run into errors you weren't expecting. You don't want to wait until a few days before go live to experience issues you've never encountered before. Testing your migration exposes many issues at an early stage, and it will also allow you to enhance your migration tool. When you test your migration, please be sure to use a full sandbox, allow the client to QC the data once you're through, and update the migration scripts as needed. I've provided some helpful resources for data migrations. Please visit www.radixbay.com/resources to download a copy of the presentation. This will allow you to access all of the websites I refer to in this slide. I would like to thank you for viewing my presentation on using Python to perform Salesforce data migrations. If you would like more information on any of our services, please visit www.radixbay.com.